In 1932, doctors at a small Virginia hospital delivered a child so genetically deformed they sealed the records for more than 60 years. The infant lived just 17 minutes, but its existence shook the very foundations of medical science. What no one knew at the time was that this child was not a tragedy of chance. It was the inevitable product of a family's darkest secret. Welcome to Hidden Docs, where we uncover America's most disturbing and forgotten histories. Tonight's story is not for the faint of heart. It's a tale of secrecy, isolation, and a bloodline so entangled that it defied the very rules of human heredity. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Sharing your thoughts helps us keep uncovering stories that others would rather stay buried. Now, let's return to the Appalachian Mountains, where the roots of this nightmare first began to grow. On a cold November night in 1932, St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia was unusually tense. A young woman arrived under a false name, heavily pregnant, her clothes handmade, her dialect so archaic that even the nurses struggled to understand her. She claimed she had no family, no husband, no identification. But there was something about her eyes, vacant, distant, that unsettled everyone who met her. Within hours, the staff realized this was no ordinary patient. The labor was difficult, lasting days instead of hours. Doctors whispered their fears behind closed doors, but no, one could have predicted what was about to happen. When the child finally emerged, Dr. Margaret Hayes froze. She had delivered thousands of babies in her career, but nothing like this. The infant's skull was malformed, one arm entirely missing, the other sprouting 7 twisted fingers. Its legs were fused together into a mass of flesh containing bones that shouldn't have been there. The breathing was shallow, erratic, the heartbeat chaotic. For 17 excruciating minutes, the doctors fought to stabilize the baby. Oxygen masks wouldn't fit, IVs couldn't be inserted. The child was slipping away, and no medical science in the world could save it. But the physical deformities were only half the horror. When a visiting geneticist examined the newborn, he quietly admitted that he had never seen a case like it before. The DNA itself seemed to tell an impossible story. The child's parents had been far too closely related, so close, in fact, that the overlap of their genes approached the limits of human survival. The infant died that night, its body quickly sealed away under hospital order. Officially, the case was recorded as severe congenital abnormalities. Unofficially, it became a ghost story whispered among the staff. Yet this tragedy didn't begin in that delivery room, and it certainly didn't end there. To truly understand what happened, we must go back nearly a century into the Appalachian Mountains, into a valley locals once called Devil's Hollow, and it was there that one man's sins planted the seed for a genetic nightmare generations in the making. To uncover the roots of that horrifying night in 1932, we have to step back almost a century, back to the year 1847. That was when a man named Jacob Holloway led his family deep into the Appalachian Mountains, into a valley so isolated that locals avoided it for generations. They called it Devil's Hollow. Why? The land itself carried a reputation. Early settlers claimed the soil was cursed, the water unclean, the nights filled with sounds that didn't belong to animals. Even the Cherokee avoided it, calling it the place where spirits grow sick. But to Jacob, Devil's Hollow was perfect. Court records from Pennsylvania, uncovered only in 2019, reveal Jacob had been accused of something unspeakable, unnatural relations with his own daughters. Though charges were dropped, his reputation was ruined. Rather than face justice or shame, Jacob vanished into the mountains with his wife Martha and their 7 children. In Devil's Hollow, he found not just isolation, but opportunity. A fortress of stone ridges and thick woods, with only one narrow pass that could be easily guarded. It was here Jacob could live by his own rules, rules the outside world would never accept. Life inside Devil's Hollow followed what Jacob called the natural order. It was a system built not on morality, but control. Daughters married brothers, cousins married cousins. Outsiders were forbidden, and anyone who questioned his laws faced punishment or worse. Jacob's obsession was simple: keep the bloodline pure, no matter the cost. Martha Holloway bore him 3 more children before she died suddenly in 1854. Locals were told it was fever, but whispers suggested otherwise, that Martha had discovered too much about Jacob's nighttime visits and paid the price. With her gone, Jacob's grip on the family became absolute. By 1860, the Holloway clan had grown to more than 40 members. They built ramshackle cabins hidden among the trees, spoke their own dialect, and worshipped in ways outsiders would later describe as twisted and unnatural. Census takers skipped over them. Tax collectors disappeared after venturing too close. Even the Civil War passed them by, leaving the Holloways in a bubble of darkness untouched by time, and with each new birth, the bloodline weakened. Cremations appeared. Children were born with extra fingers, strange faces, missing limbs. But instead of fear, Jacob saw this as destiny, a sign that his family had been chosen, transformed into something beyond human. It was the beginning of a genetic spiral that would consume 6 generations and lead, almost a century later, to the most inbred child ever born. By the late 1800s, the Holloways had lived in Devil's Hollow for over 40 years. To the outside world, they didn't exist. No census takers, no church registries, no school records. But the evidence of their isolation began to show on their bodies. Reports from a traveling preacher in 1878, uncovered in the Kentucky State Archives, described the Holloways as a people with twisted forms, slack jaws, and eyes that did not align. He wrote that children stared blankly as if their minds were elsewhere, their speech broken into grunts and murmurs. He left after one night, claiming the family's unnatural closeness made his skin crawl. Inside the settlement, Jacob's children, and now grandchildren, were marrying within the family. Cousins wed cousins, brothers took sisters as wives. It was not just accepted, it was enforced. Those who resisted faced brutal consequences. Oral accounts suggest that one boy, Eli Holloway, tried to flee in 1883. He was caught 3 miles downriver. His body was found days later, his throat cut, his face beaten beyond recognition. The Holloways were not just breeding children, they were breeding fear. But the human body has limits. By the 3rd generation, doctors from neighboring counties began whispering of strange mountain folk who came into town for supplies. They described children with missing ears, fused fingers, and unnerving stares. Some walked with twisted spines. Others never walked at all. One physician, Dr. Harold Whitlock, kept notes in 1892 after a Holloway girl was brought to him secretly by a sympathetic neighbor. She was 13, pregnant, and unable to speak. His notes read, "The deformity of her pelvis and skull suggest inbreeding of extreme severity. The child she carries is unlikely to survive. The family insists she return home immediately. I fear for her." She did return home. Neither she nor the child was ever seen again. By 1900, the Holloways had become a legend told in whispers across Kentucky. Locals called them the mountain ghosts. Some claimed their eyes glowed in the dark. Others swore you could hear screams echoing through the trees at night. Few dared to go near Devil's Hollow, and those who did rarely stayed long. Yet, despite the growing signs of decay, the Holloways themselves believed they were thriving. They saw their mutations not as weakness, but as proof they were becoming something different, something chosen. Jacob had long since died, but his laws endured, passed down through generations like scripture. And as the 20th century began, the Holloways were preparing to unleash their darkest chapter yet. Because within their cabins, inbreeding had created a child unlike any other. A child whose birth would mark the beginning of America's darkest family secret. The year was 1932, and the Holloway clan had now spent nearly a century sealed off in Devil's Hollow. By then, the inbreeding was no longer hidden. It was written on every face: sloping foreheads, stunted growth, limbs that bent at impossible angles. Some of the children never spoke a word in their lives, only groaned or wailed in the night. But out of all the children born in those cursed cabins, one stood apart. Her name was Mary Holloway. Mary was the daughter of Samuel Holloway, Jacob's great-grandson, and his own youngest sister, Ruth. By blood, Samuel was both her father and uncle. Ruth was both her mother and aunt. It was the Holloway way. But Mary's birth revealed just how deep the genetic collapse had gone. Accounts from a midwife whose diary surfaced decades later described the night vividly. The child's head was swollen, the jaw slack, the eyes not aligned. She did not cry. She did not move, only stared. I told them she would not last the week, yet they rocked her as if she was a miracle. Mary survived, and in doing so, she became a symbol for the Holloways. They called her the Chosen One, believing her deformities marked a divine transformation. But to outsiders, those rare few who caught glimpses of her in later years, Mary became a figure of horror. By age 5, Mary could barely walk. Her spine curved sharply, her gait uneven. She never learned to speak in full sentences. Instead, she muttered fragments, words strung together in ways no one could understand. Some family members swore she spoke in tongues, as if channeling something beyond them. Others said she screamed at night, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the valley like a banshee. And yet, she was cherished, protected, worshipped. When a traveling merchant stumbled into Devil's Hollow in 1937, he reported seeing a grotesque little girl seated in a wooden chair, surrounded by family members who bowed their heads in reverence. He never forgot the way her eyes seemed to follow him, mismatched and unblinking. Local authorities dismissed his claims, but rumors spread quickly. By the late 1930s, Mary Holloway was whispered about in nearby towns as the most inbred child in America. Parents frightened misbehaving children by telling them, "Behave, or Mary Holloway will come for you in the night." But inside Devil's Hollow, Mary's survival only tightened the clan's beliefs. If she could live, then their way of life must be righteous. They continued marrying within, generation after generation, convinced that outsiders were the real corruption. And while the world outside barreled into the modern age with radios, automobiles, and electric lights, inside Devil's Hollow, the Holloways clung to their darkness. Mary was just the beginning. What came after her would shock even the few who dared to investigate. By the time Mary Holloway reached her teenage years in the mid-1940s, stories about her and her family had leaked beyond the mountains. For generations, Devil's Hollow had been an isolated nightmare known only to locals. But now, word was spreading. Hunters returning from the Appalachian woods spoke of hearing strange, echoing cries at night. Some swore they saw pale, twisted figures moving among the trees, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. One hunter even claimed that a child with a crooked spine and sunken eyes had stared at him from the tree line before being yanked back by a larger, shadowy figure. But the most disturbing reports were about Mary herself. A traveling salesman, Henry Collins, wrote in his journal in 1947 about a visit to a farm on the edge of Devil's Hollow. He said a group of strange, sickly folk came to trade. Among them was a girl, short, frail, with a lopsided face and wide, unblinking eyes. She clutched a doll made of sticks and animal hair. Collins wrote, "She looked no older than 14. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Only a moan, drawn out, like something between pain and laughter. The family shielded her, but I cannot forget her face." This account, later uncovered by researchers, lined up with countless whispered stories. The Holloways were no longer just a hidden clan. They were a spectacle, a living nightmare tucked away in America's backwoods. Local sheriffs knew of the Holloways but avoided confrontation. "Best to let them rot in their own valley," one sheriff allegedly told a newspaper reporter in 1949. "Ain't nothing down there but sickness and sin." And so, the law turned a blind eye. Meanwhile, Mary became the Holloways' symbol of resilience. Though she could never read or write, she was treated almost as royalty within the family. Her deformities were celebrated as proof that the Holloways were set apart, chosen by forces outsiders could never understand. At family gatherings, she was placed at the center of the room, with relatives bowing their heads as she muttered incoherent sounds. To them, it was divine speech. But the outside world saw something else, evidence of just how far inbreeding could push the human body. By the early 1950s, whispers of the Holloways reached medical circles in Kentucky and West Virginia. Some doctors quietly discussed the Devil's Hollow case as an example of unchecked genetic collapse, yet none dared enter. Fear of violence and fear of what they might find kept them away. Still, curiosity only grew, and curiosity has a way of drawing people closer to danger, because in 1953, a group of journalists would attempt the unthinkable, entering Devil's Hollow to see the Holloways for themselves. What they discovered would turn Mary Holloway's name into legend, forever tied to America's darkest family secret. In the summer of 1953, 3 young journalists from Louisville set out on a dangerous mission. Their names were Richard Hayes, Paul Whitman, and Eleanor Price. They worked for a small, struggling newspaper, the Kentucky Tribune, desperate for a story that could make their careers. For years they had heard whispers about Devil's Hollow, a place of deformed children, incestuous families, and a girl known as the most inbred child in America. Locals warned them not to go. "Those people don't take kindly to strangers," one storekeeper told them. "And if you see the girl, don't look her in the eye. They'll think you cursed her." But the journalists were undeterred. If anything, the warnings only fueled their curiosity. Armed with notebooks, a camera, and a stubborn sense of ambition, they entered Devil's Hollow in early July. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No birds, no distant hum of farms or towns. Just the wind through the trees and the crunch of their boots on the dirt path. The cabins, when they appeared, were little more than rotting wood shacks, their roofs sagging, smoke rising weakly from broken chimneys. Then, they saw them, figures watching from the tree line, thin, pale, misshapen, some with faces that seemed melted, others with eyes that wandered in opposite directions. The journalists described a wall of stairs, silent and unblinking. Paul later wrote in his diary, "It felt less like we had discovered them, and more like they had been waiting for us." Inside the largest cabin, they met Mary Holloway. By then, she was around 20 years old, but she looked far younger, her body stunted by generations of collapse. Her spine curved so sharply she seemed folded into herself. Her eyes, one drifting outward, the other fixed, locked on Richard, the photographer. She didn't blink, he recalled in a letter. Years later, she just stared, and then she smiled. That smile has haunted me every night since. The family surrounded her protectively. When Eleanor raised her camera, an older man grabbed it and smashed it to the floor. The message was clear. No photographs. The journalists tried to ask questions, but the Holloways barely spoke. Their language was a broken mixture of grunts, whispers, and old Appalachian slang so thick it was nearly incomprehensible. The only clear word Eleanor recorded was chosen, repeated several times while pointing at Mary. Terrified, the trio left after just 2 hours. They returned to Louisville, shaken, their notes scattered and incomplete. Only one short article was ever published, describing Devil's Hollow as a place where time and humanity itself have withered. Names were omitted, photographs destroyed. The Tribune quickly buried the story, fearing backlash. But rumors of what the journalists had seen leaked anyway, and Mary Holloway's legend spread further than ever before. Still, no one could shake one question. If Mary had survived this long, what else was the Holloway family hiding in those woods? After the journalist's visit in 1953, the story of Devil's Hollow spread like wildfire through the nearby towns of Harlan and Pikeville. But it wasn't printed in newspapers. It was whispered in diners, passed around church pews, and told like a ghost story around campfires. Everyone seemed to know someone who had seen the Holloways. A man who claimed he delivered flour to them once. A woman who swore her cousin had disappeared near their land. Each tale was darker than the last. Sheriff William Bill Kincaid had heard the stories for years. But the visit from outsiders, the journalists from Louisville, changed everything. When folks from the city start poking around, he told a deputy, it ain't just rumor no more. It's trouble. By the fall of 1954, complaints were reaching his office. Farmers reported missing livestock. A young girl from a nearby community vanished on her way home from school. Some whispered she had been taken by the Holloways. Sheriff Kincaid knew the family lived in isolation, but he also knew his jurisdiction didn't quite reach that far. Devil's Hollow was a no-man's land, cut off, forgotten, and, in many ways, deliberately ignored. Still, pressure was mounting. Parents demanded answers. Preachers warned of a cursed bloodline that had forsaken God. Even the governor's office received letters pleading for an investigation. But each time the idea surfaced, officials backed down. Why? Because no one wanted to go in. One night in November 1954, Kincaid gathered a small posse, 3 deputies and 2 volunteers. They rode out to Devil's Hollow, lanterns swinging, rifles strapped to their backs. Locals later recalled seeing them enter the tree line, but none of them went far enough to follow. What happened next was pieced together only from Kincaid's written report. The posse made it to the Holloway homestead just before midnight. They found the cabins dark, no sign of fire or smoke. The woods were deathly silent, as if the animals themselves avoided the place. Then, from one cabin, came the sound of crying. Not the cry of a woman, not the cry of a baby. Something in between. When they approached, the sound stopped. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for Kincaid to glimpse what he later called a malformed figure rocking back and forth. His deputies begged him not to enter. He didn't. Instead, they left quickly, shaken to their core. Kincaid filed a vague report describing Devil's Hollow as unsafe, unfit for habitation, and best left undisturbed. But the crying haunted him. In private conversations, he admitted it sounded like Mary Holloway. The same girl the journalists had seen, except now, she wasn't alone. By 1955, whispers turned into warnings. Mothers told their children never to wander near the hollow. Fathers carried rifles when hunting close to the ridge. And whenever strange, noises drifted through the valleys at night. People muttered only one name, Holloway. The county would never be the same. And yet, the deeper truth of what was happening inside those cabins remained locked away, hidden by both fear and silence. By the early 1960s, Devil's Hollow had become more than just a local legend. It was a living curse that cast its shadow across the entire county. People rarely spoke of it openly, but everyone knew it was there, lurking like a wound that refused to heal. What made matters worse was the disappearances. Between 1961 and 1964, at least 4 travelers vanished along the back roads that skirted the hollow. A pair of hunters never returned home. A drifter passing through Pikeville was last seen heading toward the ridge. And then there was the most chilling case. A young boy, just 12 years old, who vanished while fishing near the creek that ran down from Devil's Hollow. His body was never found. Each time, the official explanation was the same: wild animals, accidents, people who had simply left town. But in hushed tones, locals insisted otherwise. The Holloways took them. Inside the valley, the Holloway family itself was shrinking. Generations of inbreeding had left their mark. Children were being born weaker, smaller, and more deformed than ever before. Survivors from those years, doctors who later examined the records in secret, claimed that the family was collapsing in on itself, like a bloodline eating its own bones. Neighbors reported seeing fewer figures moving about the cabins. Smoke rarely rose from the chimneys. And when sounds did echo through the forest, they were more disturbing than ever. Low moans, animal-like howls, and at times, strange chanting that carried on the wind. It was around this time that Dr. Edmund Carver, the geneticist from the University of Virginia, quietly resumed his interest in the Holloways. Though decades had passed since Sarah's tragic delivery in 1932, Carver had never forgotten the infant that lived only 17 minutes. Now he began collecting stories again, interviewing old locals, tracking down birth records, and building a secret archive that would one day expose the Holloway bloodline to the world. Carver wasn't alone. A new wave of curiosity was rising, thanks to the 1965 Appalachian Survey, a government project meant to study poverty in isolated mountain communities. Researchers traveled county by county, photographing families, documenting health conditions, and mapping forgotten valleys. When their work brought them near Devil's Hollow, they noticed something chilling. The census lists showed names: Holloway, Carter, Abel, but the corresponding houses were empty, almost as if the family was disappearing in real time. The surveyors didn't press further. Locals warned them, "You don't go into Devil's Hollow, not unless you want to come out changed or not come out at all." By the end of the 1960s, it seemed the Holloways were fading. Some believed disease was wiping them out. Others said they'd fled deeper into the mountains. But a handful of hunters swore they still saw figures in the trees, gaunt, twisted shadows watching from a distance, too malformed to belong to outsiders, too human to be animals. The Holloways weren't gone. They were waiting, and when they finally emerged, the world would see just how deep their curse ran. By the 1970s, America was changing. The country was in the middle of social upheaval, civil rights, Vietnam protests, and a growing distrust of government. But in the quiet backroads of Appalachia, another story was quietly clawing its way back into the light. The story of the Holloways. It started small. In 1972, a group of university students from Lexington came to Pike County as part of an anthropology project. Their goal was to record folk songs and oral traditions from mountain families. What they found instead were whispers, half-muttered tales about a cursed valley, the Blood People, and a woman who birthed the Devil's Child in 32. Intrigued, the students pressed for details. Most locals refused to speak, but one elderly farmer finally gave them a warning. "Don't go looking for Devil's Hollow. The earth don't want you there. And if the Holloways see you, you won't come back." The students laughed it off as superstition. But a few weeks later, their professor received a letter from them. It described strange findings: collapsed cabins, animal bones arranged in patterns, and a crude wooden cross carved with the name Sarah. The letter ended abruptly. "We're going back tomorrow for one last look." They were never heard from again. The university quietly shut down the project, and the story was buried. But fragments of the students' notes survived, circulating in underground academic circles. Meanwhile, Dr. Edmund Carver, now an aging man in his 70s, began piecing together everything he had gathered since 1932. His private archives contained photographs of malformed infants, genealogical charts of impossible marriages, and handwritten testimonies from locals who had seen the Holloways firsthand. Carver knew that publishing the truth could destroy his reputation, but he also knew that silence would bury one of the most disturbing case studies in medical history. By 1977, Carver started sharing his research informally with a small group of colleagues. One of them later recalled, "He showed us a family tree that looked more like a circle, generations folding in on themselves until the DNA collapsed. I remember thinking, this isn't just a family anymore. It's something else." At the same time, rumors of Devil's Hollow began appearing in tabloid newspapers. Headlines like "Inbred Monster Clan Found in Appalachia" and "The Devil's Children of Kentucky" sold thousands of copies. Most dismissed them as sensationalist trash, but the seeds were planted. People across America were hearing about the Holloways for the first time. Local authorities grew uneasy. Sheriff's deputies in Pike County were instructed never to enter Devil's Hollow, even on official business. One deputy later admitted, "It wasn't the law keeping us out, it was fear. You could feel it in the air when you got near that valley, like the woods were holding their breath." By the end of the decade, Devil's Hollow was no longer just a secret. It had become a myth, a dark legend that blurred the line between history and horror. And yet, beneath the myth, there was truth waiting to be unearthed. Because the Holloways were not finished, their bloodline had not ended, and in the coming decade, the world would finally see the evidence. By the 1980s, the Holloway family had almost vanished from sight. Their cabins were rotting into the ground. Their cemetery, overgrown with weeds, was little more than a field of nameless stones. But while Devil's Hollow seemed silent, the truth buried there was about to erupt onto the world stage. Dr. Edmund Carver, now in his 80s and battling terminal cancer, could no longer carry the weight of what he had seen. For nearly 50 years, he had hidden his files, sealed boxes of photographs, tissue samples, and genetic charts so disturbing that even his closest colleagues had begged him to burn them. But Carver believed the world needed to know. In 1984, he published his most controversial work, Extreme Consanguinity in an Isolated Population, a case study in genetic collapse. It appeared in the Journal of Human Genetics, a respected publication that rarely courted scandal. But this paper was different. It named no family, no exact location. Yet every line carried the unmistakable shadow of Devil's Hollow. Carver's findings were shocking. He documented a coefficient of inbreeding higher than any recorded in humans, levels normally seen only in laboratory animals bred for genetic testing. He described children born with fused limbs, collapsed skulls, and organs that grew outside their bodies. He detailed marriages between siblings, cousins, uncles, and nieces, patterns so extreme they defied the natural order of survival, and at the heart of it all was one infant, born in 1932, who lived for exactly 17 minutes. Carver called it the most severely compromised human ever recorded. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some scientists praised Carver for his courage, calling his work a groundbreaking warning about the dangers of genetic isolation. Others denounced it as unethical, even monstrous. Eugenics advocates seized on the paper as proof of their twisted theories, while ethicists warned that it should be read only as a cautionary tale. But perhaps most disturbing was the response from locals. Within weeks of the paper's publication, rumors spread that journalists, researchers, even government agents were descending on Pike County. Some claimed to have seen black vans parked near the old Holloway Valley. Others whispered that the cemetery was disturbed, graves dug open, remains taken away under the cover of night. The Holloways themselves, if any remained, were nowhere to be found. Some insisted they had died out. Others swore they still lived in the woods, hiding, watching, waiting. A retired sheriff, interviewed in 1986, put it bluntly, "They didn't just vanish, they sank back into the mountains, and I'll tell you, this, if they don't want to be found, you won't find them." By the end of the decade, Devil's Hollow had become a national obsession. Documentaries, magazine features, even horror novels borrowed pieces of the Holloway legend. But behind the sensational headlines, the truth remained darker than any fiction. The Holloway story wasn't just about one family's sins. It was about how secrecy, shame, and silence could breed something so unnatural that it defied science itself. And though the Holloways' last known child had lived only 17 minutes, the family's shadow stretched on, long past their graves, long past the valley, and deep into America's collective memory. By the 1990s, the Holloway case had transformed from a whispered local scandal into a full-fledged cultural phenomenon. America, now consumed by tabloid journalism and late-night television, had a new obsession: the children of Devil's Hollow. Paranormal investigators called the valley cursed ground. True crime writers branded the Holloways America's lost bloodline. And horror filmmakers, always hungry for grotesque inspiration, borrowed heavily from the family's story. In 1994, a low-budget film titled Children of the Hollow grossed millions, cementing the Holloways as part of pop culture. But while Hollywood was busy turning their pain into entertainment, scientists were beginning to revisit Dr. Carver's files. Advances in genetics during the Human Genome Project, 1990-2003, allowed researchers to reanalyze samples that had sat in freezers for decades. The results were staggering. Carver had not exaggerated. DNA sequencing revealed levels of homozygosity, genetic sameness, almost never seen in humans. Genes critical for immunity, fertility, and brain development were severely compromised. Some researchers suggested that Holloway children might have had lifespans measured in hours, not years. One scientist at the University of Kentucky, interviewed anonymously in 1998, said, "It wasn't just inbreeding. It was a complete collapse of the human blueprint. We're talking about a level of degradation that challenges what we define as viable life." These findings reignited debates about Carver's ethics. Should these samples even exist? Did the Holloways ever consent to becoming specimens? Critics accused Carver and his colleagues of exploiting a vulnerable, isolated family for scientific glory. Others countered that by exposing their tragedy, Carver had prevented future generations from falling into the same cycle of genetic collapse. Meanwhile, in Pike County itself, the Holloway myth only deepened. Locals told stories of strange cries, heard in the woods at night, or of shadowy figures glimpsed near the old cabin foundations. Hunters claimed to see deformed tracks in the mud, prints too twisted to belong to man or beast. Some swore the Holloways had not died out at all, that a few survivors had scattered, blending into nearby towns, hiding their lineage. Rumors spread of children born in the 1990s with Holloway features, wide-set eyes, low ears, cleft palates. No one could prove it, but whispers grew louder with every passing year. By the early 2000s, internet forums became fertile ground for Holloway speculation. Conspiracy sites claimed the government had sealed records, or that Holloway DNA had been used in secret military experiments. On paranormal boards, users traded grainy photos of alleged Holloway graves, insisting the family's bloodline continued in secret. But perhaps the most disturbing theory came from an investigative journalist named Rachel McKenna, who published a controversial exposé in 2002 titled Bloodlines of Shame. In it, she argued that at least 2 Holloway descendants had quietly assimilated into neighboring towns under new names. She even named families she believed were connected, sparking outrage, lawsuits, and death threats. Still, McKenna's book sold tens of thousands of copies, and the Holloway name, once hidden in shame, was now etched permanently into America's cultural psyche. The Holloways had become more than a family. They were a warning, a legend, and a mirror, forcing America to confront its darkest instincts about secrecy, isolation, and what happens when a community turns its back on its own. And yet, as the 21st century dawned, one question lingered like a shadow over Devil's Hollow. Had the bloodline truly ended? Or had it simply gone deeper underground? The early 2010s changed everything. For the first time in history, millions of ordinary Americans were mailing off saliva samples to companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. The promise was innocent enough. Learn about your heritage, find distant, Cousins. Discover if you had Irish or Italian blood. But what many people didn't realize was that DNA never lies, and sometimes it reveals things you never wanted to know. In 2013, whispers began to spread in Kentucky genealogy circles. A handful of users who had submitted tests to Ancestry DNA received unusual results, matches they couldn't explain, relatives they had never heard of, relatives who all seemed to trace back to a single forgotten valley in Pike County. At first, it seemed like a fluke. But as more users uploaded results, a disturbing pattern emerged. These families were all connected by what geneticists call runs of homozygosity, stretches of identical DNA that suggested generations of inbreeding. The signatures were unmistakable. To experts, it looked eerily familiar. In fact, it looked exactly like the profiles stored in Dr. Carver's old Holloway files. A science blogger named Ethan Ward broke the story in 2014, publishing a viral article titled, "The Ghosts in Our Genes, Are the Holloways Still Among Us?" His piece compared public ancestry DNA results with fragments of Carver's data, and the overlap was chilling. According to Ward, at least 3 living families in Kentucky and West Virginia showed genetic markers nearly identical to those preserved. From Holloway samples in the 1930s, the backlash was immediate. Ancestry.com refused to comment. 23andMe dismissed the claims as misinterpretations. But for locals in Pike County, it was like ripping open an old wound. Suddenly, people who had lived quietly for generations found themselves at the center of a national firestorm. One woman in Pikeville recalled being confronted at a grocery store by strangers whispering, "That's one of them." Families who had always suspected something unusual in their ancestry were now branded with the Holloway curse. By 2016, the controversy had reached mainstream media. National Geographic ran a feature asking bluntly, "Did the Holloway bloodline survive?" The article stopped short of naming names, but it hinted that at least one confirmed descendant was still alive, and that's where the story turned darker. Rumors began circulating that at least 2 Holloway descendants had quietly submitted their DNA samples to testing companies, only to have their accounts mysteriously deleted within weeks. Some claimed it was the companies themselves, scrubbing the data to avoid scandal. Others swore it was the government, stepping in to bury the truth once again. One genealogist who tried to investigate received threatening emails, warning him to leave the Holloways buried. Another claimed his car was tampered with after he gave a podcast interview. Whether fact or paranoia, one thing was certain: the Holloway name had risen from the grave. What had once been a rural legend was now a digital ghost, etched into the DNA databases of the modern world. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all was this: DNA isn't just about the past. It lives in the present, carried quietly inside. Thousands of people who may never know their connection. The Holloways may have been forgotten by history, but their bloodline, twisted, damaged, and hidden, was still out there. By the 2020s, the Holloway story had escaped the confines of dusty archives and academic journals. It was no longer just a dark footnote in Kentucky's history. It had become digital folklore. On TikTok, users posted eerie videos tagged Dr. Holloway curse, overlaying old Appalachian photos with distorted lullabies. On YouTube, storytellers with millions of subscribers uploaded long-form documentaries titled The Most Inbred Family in America, drawing tens of millions of views. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to dissecting the Holloways, blending fact and speculation until truth itself seemed slippery. The Holloways had become something larger than life, part ghost story, part true crime, part warning about what happens when shame, secrecy, and isolation twist a family tree into something unrecognizable. But as the legend grew online, so did the danger. In 2021, a group of amateur explorers trespassed into Devil's Hollow, live-streaming their adventure. They claimed to have found the ruins of the old Holloway cabins, rotting wood, rusted tools, even fragments of children's toys. The video racked up over 2 million views in a week, But locals were furious, accusing the YouTubers of desecrating sacred ground. Within days, the stream was deleted, and the explorers reported receiving anonymous threats. Still, the myth thrived. For every skeptic insisting the Holloways were just a cautionary tale, there were others convinced the bloodline lived on. DNA forums still buzzed with speculation about distant cousins who matched Holloway profiles. Conspiracy channels accused the government of hiding descendants in witness protection-style programs. And every so often, a blurry photograph of a child with Holloway features would surface, reigniting the firestorm. Yet behind the viral content, one truth remained hauntingly clear. The Holloway story had never truly ended. It had only shifted forms, passed from whispered porch tales in the 1930s to journal articles in the 1980s, and now to digital feeds scrolling endlessly on smartphones around the world. For Pike County locals, it was a curse they couldn't escape. As one elderly resident put it in a 2022 interview, "We used to keep the Holloways in the shadows. Now they're everywhere. The whole world knows our shame." And perhaps that was the final irony. The Holloways, who had lived in secrecy for generations, had become immortal not by blood, but by story. A family once hidden in the mountains was now preserved forever in servers, streams, and search engines. The question that lingers isn't whether the Holloways survived, it's whether we, as a society, wanted them to. Did we keep digging into their tragedy out of a need for truth, or because we were drawn, morbidly, to the spectacle of human ruin? In the end, the Holloways are less about one family and more about us, our fascination with the grotesque, our hunger for taboo, and our inability to look away from the darkest corners of our own history. So when you scroll past a Holloway video, late at night, remember, it's not just a story, it's a shadow of real people, a warning written in bone and blood. And like DNA itself, legends never truly die. They only pass on, generation after generation, click after click, whisper after whisper.